Hello, hello. This is Allie. Welcome to the Long Game Podcast. Today I chat with Amanda Natividad, VP of Marketing for audience research tool SparkToro. She and I have been Twitter friends now for a few years, and I'm a huge fan of hers and her sense of humor. Amanda is also a contributor for Adweek, a professionally trained chef, and former journalist. She previously led marketing for Growth Machine, led marketing for Liftopia, built Fitbit's B2B content program, and led content and communications for NatureBox. In this episode, Amanda and I discuss the recent trend of quiet quitting, building businesses remotely and with friends, how and why to build an audience, and much, much more. I think you'll enjoy. Without further ado, here's Amanda. Thanks for joining me. This is really exciting.
Yeah.
We finally get to do this. So I like to ask everyone when we start, just like, what are you working on this week? What's on your plate?
Oh my gosh.
Because most people that join us every day is different, I've learned.
Yeah.
So I like to ask, like, what does this week look like? What's on your mind?
Yeah. And I bet that's especially true for a lot of the people you talk with who are working at startups or who work at agencies and who are consultants. So this week, what is largely on my mind are two things at SparkToro. One is we are planning our first virtual summit. It's going to be in November. And the other thing is I'm starting to explore some sponsorship opportunities for SparkToro.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we have a pretty good, I think in some ways we are sort of a mini media company. So we are looking to partner with brands who we admire, who we share an audience with, where we think there could be some really interesting sponsorship or co-marketing opportunities. So those are pretty exciting to me right now.
That is awesome. So would you sponsor like newsletters or events or just all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above / looking for people to sponsor us.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's exciting. That's really cool. I know you all have gotten really into events lately. I've seen a lot about office hours, about the deck you just built. You said it might take you 5 minutes, ended up taking you 2.5 hours. I totally feel that. How has that, the lifespan of that event marketing strategy been? Like, how did it start and kind of how has it changed over time?
Yeah. So, it actually started. So we've been doing this for, I guess, over a year now. It started out as this need to be like, well, we need to better educate our users about our product, show them some easy ways to incorporate it into their daily work routines, all that good stuff. And I mean, my boss, Rand Fishkin, is very good at presenting and being on video and all that stuff. So it also just felt like, well, one, it made sense to basically do demos of a product, but two, I think our unfair advantage is that we have Rand Fishkin, who is really good at presenting, at being on video. But the way that we have shaped up this event was we didn't want this to be like, hey, tune in and we will show you everything about SparkToro, because that's not fun for people, right?
No,
It's like saying, hey, join my webinar and I'll talk about me the entire time. So we've basically shaped up ongoing presentations about marketing strategy or about tactics in marketing, and have used and have also shown here's how you can do all these great things like better cold outreach or pitching to your clients. But here's how you can also do it using SparkToro if you were to choose to do that.
Gotcha. So it's like a compliment to the product, not too product centric.
Yeah, or it's a little bit of both, right? Where it's here's how you can do it in general or manually, or here are other tools you can use, but also here's SparkToro. So that way there's value for everybody. There's value for people who just want marketing advice and have no idea what SparkToro is. Right. And there's value for people who are free or paid users of SparkToro. But the other part of your question was about how has it evolved? How has it evolved over time? I think there have been some presentations, and probably the most recent one, in which we have deviated from it being a product demo, where there have been times where I've been like, oh, shoot, I didn't include anything about SparkToro. Maybe I should. So there's a little bit of that. And I guess I'll wrap this up with overall, what has been really fun about office hours and, this event marketing strategy has been seeing how or finding ways to weave this into our content, like our blog posts, our social media, and creating this sort of flywheel where all these things kind of power each other. So that's been really fun and really interesting to play with.
What has been your written content strategy that complements office hours? What does that look like?
So the way that I'm seeing it now, and I think this is kind of the ideal way to work, or at least for me, is so I see opportunities like social media and events / whether that's physical or whether that's digital. So in-person conferences or webinars. These are live opportunities, right? They're live in some way. Like a tweet is live in the sense that generally, like you're tweeting something or you're posting on social media as the experience is live to you, right? Generally speaking. And then I see the blog as the source of truth. Like this is where the final information goes. So I think, and I'm seeing this as like, I think this is a counterintuitive finding because I think most people or most marketers tend to see events as like, oh, that's the final product. Like, yeah, you write a blog post or you write some tweets, you write a LinkedIn post, but your webinar, that's a final presentation. Like get it all buttoned up for the presentation. I'm going to say it should be the other way around. Where the event is one of your testing grounds for a concept, for an idea. And your blog post is the final product because your blog post is the thing that stands the test of time. Like that's the thing that people are going to be searching for on Google or they'll stumble upon on your website. Nobody's going to stumble upon your webinar or your conference speaking slot. So I'm going to challenge people who kind of see these events as the final polish opportunities and challenge them to think of those as those should be near final. Like, yeah, you shouldn't get on stage, whether it's virtual or physical, and just kind of like say random things, right? You should have like a strategy involved. You should have an idea that's fully fleshed out with concrete talking points and evidence. But take the opportunity to continue to refine that idea so that when you do the blog post, it's final. So that's how I see that. And so I've done this, and I'll also say I've done this in two ways. So I've done that way I've done an office hours presentation on cold outreach, and that turned that into a blog post. That was great. I've also done the kind of inverse of this, where I've done a blog post that I've then used to promote a webinar. So that more recent example is a blog post I did on audience personas. It was this whole notion about how traditional or classic buyer personas are flawed and how we as marketers should be thinking about our entire audience, not just the people who might buy our product. So audience personas. So I wrote this blog post and then ended up using that to promote the webinar. So I think these things can go both ways, but I think ideal is to make the blog post the source of truth.
Did you update the blog post on audience personas at all after your webinar?
No, but I should. And that's a great question. I was like, oh, shoot, I should. And like whatever things that didn't resonate on stage, I should totally fix that.
Well, there's a couple things. So first of all, and this might just be from my perspective, I always feel like live conversation, especially like a two-sided event, whether it's a one-on-one call like this, maybe you do like a roundtable, a live conversation like you did in front of an audience. There's a lot that comes out maybe out of your subconscious. Whereas writing a blog post, like you're sitting in front of your words, and obviously as you build it, it's a little bit more tangible. So you're focused on the end product. Whereas I'm not sure. I've been thinking a lot about the way I brainstorm best. And I like to brainstorm out loud, live, like chatter, riffing, all of that stuff. And I feel like when folks do events like that, whether it's like this or your big talk, stuff comes out and you're like, holy shit, I didn't even think about that. Or like, that's such a good point. And not to mention you get feedback, whether from it's your audience, your co-speaker, you and Rand probably like talk about stuff. You're like, that's good. We should capture that. So it's cool to use written posts like blog posts or even social to promote. But I always feel like like you said, like that live-esque event type thing, the final product probably generates some stuff that could then go back and be part of like the blog post, stuff like that.
Totally. I love that you call these feedback opportunities because that's exactly how I see it. Like whether it's, whether it's an exchange with a colleague, that's a live feedback opportunity, or like a smaller kind of closed door event, or a webinar. Like those are all opportunities to continue to refine. I feel like people maybe just get bogged down in like, oh no, it needs to be perfect, it needs to be final, like it needs to be like the perfect, like whatever final thought with all the things. But when you get that feedback, that live feedback, maybe you'll get people who add on to your idea, who are like, oh, I like that concept. I would also suggest, citing this thing or looking at this other brand that's doing this well. And then you can continue to, as the owner of that idea, so to speak, you can continue to refine that piece and add more like defensibility to it, so to speak.
Yeah, I can see where the live type content, it's intimidating, because you're out there, and when you put something out there, it's out there. So I can see where the pressure, because I've felt the same thing. The few times I've talked live, I'm like, this has to be perfect. Like this, I mean, once I say it, it's out there. And people will make every assumption about me from this one presentation. Not true, but like I get nervous public speaking, all that stuff. So I feel like it has to be perfect. But yeah, it's just an opportunity to like iterate. Whereas like blog posts and stuff, like you said, it's not concrete. You can always update it, but it is more of a source of truth. So
yeah.
That's really interesting. Sorry that my cat is just like hanging out on my desk right now. I kept like pushing him away. Okay. So you work with Rand Fishkin, who is very famous in our circle. And I know you pitched him on your current job. And I would love to learn more about how the conversation was like.
Yeah. So it was funny because we met up for lunch. We and his wife, Geraldine, we met up for lunch, got to just hang out, and like a total nerd, I brought their books with me, and I was like, "Can you sign them?"
No. I would have done the same thing.
Yeah, right. But I say that for the end, so it wouldn't be so weird, right? But I was so excited to meet them, and I'll say that because I had read their books and had generally kept up with them on Twitter and stuff, I felt like I knew them really well, and of course, I have not written a book, and I have published much less than they have online. So they had a lot of questions for me, or like really wanted to get to know me. And I think I'm pointing this out first because I got to share a lot about like my work experiences, what I wanted out of my career, what I wanted out of work. And I got to share this in a way that I felt comfortable being more candid and being very chatty because I was like, well, I already know them. Like,
right.
Not that I wasn't interested in them, of course, but just that I felt like I already had like all that context, but they didn't have it for me. So when they had all these questions for me and like wanted to get to know me, it felt normal, right? Like it felt like, oh, this feels like an equal balance because they obviously know less about me than I know about them. So in getting to share about what I wanted out of work, out of my career, then the conversation kind of naturally shifted to like what might it look like to work together? And then because I wasn't actively looking at the time, I got to be very candid about like, oh, like, you know what? I don't at this, current stage, like I don't like managing people, and Rand was like, yeah, that sucks. I get it. And then I got to say like, yeah, I'm looking for a remote job, or would want to stay remote.
Right.
And so got to be candid there where I didn't worry about whether or not I was impressing him because he wasn't hired. He wasn't looking to hire.
It wasn't an interview. Right.
It wasn't an interview. That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, it was like, wow, like we are like kindred spirits. And then I was like, could I pitch you on what it might look like to work together? And he was like, okay, sure. So I got to share a little bit about how I envision content for SparkToro, how I might be able to support him, Rand specifically, why I care so much about SparkToro. And from there, it just became a kind of natural progression in the conversations when I got to meet like Rand's co-founder, Casey, where like it felt like we had good vibes and, it all kind of just fell into place.
Had you been using SparkToro in your previous job or the one you were currently in at that time?
I was using a lot of their free tools. Yeah.
Okay. So you had like obviously a good idea of the product and then from a marketing perspective too. And you mentioned too, I remember when we talked before that you preferred like the culture and the pace of a smaller company, more of the startup vibe, definitely kind of a do your own thing. What has that kind of culture allowed you to build and focus on, especially considering where you were before SparkToro?
Yeah. It's funny because I'm hearing a lot, in the news about something called quiet quitting, right? Where there's like, I think a negative way to look at it, which is the way that most media publications and the general like zeitgeist is conveying this, which is like Gen Z is lazy, like they don't want to work too hard, and, people are ghosting their bosses and all that stuff. But the positive side to this, which is the way I'm seeing it, is it's that people are, and I think it's primarily Gen Z. I think people are now taking a stance and being like, I have boundaries. Like, I'm not going to be checking my email at midnight. I'm not going to respond to that thing, like at 10 p.m. when it can wait until the morning, or I'm not going to do all this extra work and then not get paid for it. And so I'm saying this because I feel like I've been able to kind of adopt this sort of quiet quitting mentality, but I see it as a positive thing. Like if there's a big project at SparkToro or some kind of like big launch, like the way I see it is, of course, I'm going to work harder, maybe longer hours, be online a little more. Like I see that as like, that's a normal thing. But when we don't have a big deadline or like a big thing that we're working on, then I'm going to take it easy. And it's helped me to create better work-life integration. Like I've been able to spend more time with my family in ways that, like, I think in a traditional office environment, I would have more guilt about. But it feels very healthy at SparkToro and just being a remote worker.
Yeah, it's been interesting reading a bit about it, because when I first also, I think the name that it's been given is pretty misleading. Like I thought it was literally just like quitting without giving notice or something before I read like the New York Times article or something. And then I was like, these people aren't quitting. It's just called boundaries. And I think it's an interesting time that it's surfacing, because I remember, like, I'm a millennial, I guess, and our generation of work, I feel like it was rebellious in that it wasn't so obsessed with this corporate work environment that I'm assuming most of our parents were a part of. But it did favor hustle culture. And that was kind of the vibe in a way. So like our generation saw a lot of startups, San Francisco, all the vibes, all the VC and everything. And that typically required a lot of work, a lot of extra work and uncompensated labor, do what needs to be done kind of thing. And it's cool to read about quiet quitting. But I do think that some parts of some of our jobs do require a little bit more work outside of the typical lines, which you defined really well, when projects require it. But on the flip side, when they don't require it, you probably get to sign off early, spend some more time with your family. If you have a day where you're not really, not feeling it and there's nothing really demanding of you, it's nice to have that flexibility.
Totally.
Especially now that most of us are working from home.
Yeah, totally. And that's so funny that you, and what you said about quiet quitting, and that when I first heard it too, I think I thought the same thing as you.
Yeah.
Like, I thought quiet quitting meant people who would like log into Slack and then peace out for the rest of the day. Right. Like they would like do that, like show that they were active, but then like not actually work. I was like, is that quiet quitting?
Did you see all those videos like during the pandemic of people like putting their mouse like behind their Roomba, or like tying it to their like cat's like collar, so it would like run around and like be online and move, or like they would go watch TV and then come in and move their mouse a little bit, and I'm like, dang, like that's the bare minimum. But
that really is. That's really funny.
Yeah, people got real creative working from home. Have you always been remote?
Mostly, yeah. Like my first job out of college was mostly remote. Like I was working in tech news, and the nature of the news cycle isn't 9 to 5. So it didn't make sense for people to be in an office 9 to 5. So in that situation, I was like mostly working from home, but would come into the office a couple times per week. I think the times that I was not a remote worker, I still had some remote capabilities. But so like I kind of, starting my career in a virtual like environment or remote environment, I've been no stranger to it. And so being a fully remote worker again, or now, I feel like now that I'm older, and just more, more experienced in the world of work, it feels like a much better fit for me now,
Yeah.
Whereas I think in being a remote worker, like fresh out of college, it was cool to have the flexibility, because it's always cool to have flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a time when, like, a couple years into my journalism job, that I was kind of like, I think it would really benefit me to, like, work in a traditional office environment. Like, I'm young, like, maybe I need more structure. Like, and I was also just like, I don't know how to run a meeting or, like, be in a meeting. Like, how do people do these things? Right. I don't think personally, I don't think any of that is intuitive. I think you just kind of, like, learn by being in the room and seeing how people do it, trying it out for yourself. So I did kind of want more of that structure when I was young.
Yeah, I can relate to that. My very first job out of college, I worked at GE Appliances. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and that was the biggest employer in the city. And my grandpa actually worked there. So I joined the company as an intern, and then my first job, and I was like, this is not for me. Like, it was very corporate. Like, they didn't even do, like, casual Fridays or anything. And soon after, I started freelancing, and I was very much on my own. And I remember after about a year and a half, that's when I joined HubSpot. And it's not super common, I guess, to go from freelancing back in-house. I got a lot of questions about that. I think to each their own, but especially now with that freelancing has so much support, it's pretty rare. And I was like, I want happy hours. Like, I'm only 23. Like, I want that culture. I want to be a part of something structured, like you said, and give it a little bit more organization, especially so young. You're not taught that stuff in school. Yeah,
totally. Well, now that you're remote again, how does this compare to when you were much younger and doing the freelance thing for the first time? Like, are there things now that you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I used to do, invoicing this way instead of that way, or whatever.
Yeah, I was very freelancing. It was like 2016 that I was freelancing. Honestly, Kaylee Moore was my mentor at the time, and she was, like, a huge proponent of, like, niching down your website. So she gave my business a lot of structure, but you were still a solo person. So at the very core of it, I was really lonely, and I also didn't really know how to continue to hone my own skills without basically, like, paying for it at the time, which, like, was fine, but I was young and I didn't have a ton of cash. So I joined HubSpot. And the funny thing is, like, I was remote with HubSpot. So I wasn't necessarily in the office, but just having the structure of, like, a Slack channel and a manager and projects and, like, trainings. Like, I know we talked a lot about how we don't like the whole corporate training thing now, but at the time I did appreciate it and I learned a ton. But being remote now, during and after the pandemic, is a whole different world than it was before the pandemic. Like, I was the one person that dialed into the meeting and everyone else was in the room. Like, I was the only remote person on my team, and I really liked it. Like, I did my own thing. Like, I showed up when I needed to, but I was kind of left to my own devices. And I think I thrived at that because I was a former freelancer. So I'd already known how that was like, but I got to benefit from the added structure of just being part of a corporation or a big company. But yeah, it's so different now. I think people who weren't remote before, there was a huge learning curve during the pandemic. I don't know if you remember that. People just like, what do I do at home all day? Like, I'm like, you work.
That is so interesting. You were the only one who dialed in while everyone else was in the conference room. Wasn't that frustrating, like, to keep up with conversations, or was it actually okay?
I think because of the nature of my job as a writer, most of our work was very autonomous just by nature. Like, I wasn't an engineer. I can't speak for that, but I wasn't like a salesperson or an engineer or whatever developer maybe that needed to be, like, super involved, like, hands-on. Like, we didn't have a lot of meetings in general. So the few that we did, brainstorm meetings, calendar chats, maybe some product calls. But I think, like, my very early days at HubSpot, I had like 4 meetings a week. So I didn't really have a ton to feel like I was missing out on. And they also covered a lot of travel. Like, once a quarter, I went in to Boston. So it was a nice, like, way of splitting up my schedule. But I remember, like, when the pandemic hit and everyone went remote, my meeting schedule quadrupled, because I think people who are used to being in the office were like, I need people. I need to see them. I want to talk to everybody. Like, and I don't blame them. Like, you're used to literally being hands or arm's length from folks, coffee chats, walking to lunch. Like, I've never had that culture ever. So I was used to it. But I think the pandemic turned a lot of people upside down for a bit.
Yeah. Because I mean,
like most folks have adjusted.
For sure. And I mean, I think, like, a big adjustment for a lot of people, I think, was in everyone being remote, there are no opportunities for those serendipitous conversations that you get, like when you're getting coffee in the break room.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to figure out how to generate those moments of serendipity.
Well, with a small team, you, Rand, and Casey, how do you do that?
I will say, I mean, like we recently met in person this summer, and like that was really nice. Like I think, and like Casey and I mean, we talked about this, like where we were like, it was really nice to like do work stuff in person, and it was like meeting all day, like doing meetings, like not meetings, which was 3 of us. It was a meeting, but it was like talking through new projects together and like kind of like in a friendly way, challenging each other on like what could work, what won't work, all that stuff. Like it felt really healthy. But in terms of like kind of generating this day to day, I mean, it does, like every now and then we'll like be in a group chat and we'll just kind of like talk about random stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, I honestly think that helps. If nothing else, it helps morale. Like it just helps you feel connected to people. Or like randomly I'll share something about like my child, or maybe Casey will do the same. And then we're like, oh, that's cool. Like, or like, oh, have a fun trip. Or I think what we are kind of naturally good at with each other is sharing a little bit about like what we do outside of work without it being like crossing any lines. Right. Yeah. Where like if Casey goes on a trip with his family, you know, we're not going to be like, where are you going? Right. Like show us pictures, but he'll be like, oh, I'm going on this like caving trip. And like, we're really excited about it. And then you know, Rand and I will be like, hey, that sounds awesome. And and then Casey will share a couple pictures at the end. And it's just really nice to see.
Yeah. Cause there's been so much, well, and I guess I'm referring more to like building a business, which you are, like you're part of that core team, versus just normal colleague relationships. But I mean, in a workplace that happened all the time. Happy hours, people would become out of work friends. Like a lot of my colleagues, my old colleagues at HubSpot, like their friends were their coworkers, and that was normal. But there was the sense of going into the office, the physicality of that just naturally created a boundary. So moving into a remote role, into a remote culture, the boundaries, there are no more like I leave and go to work and now I go home. So anytime we're out of the office, we're not working. And now it's not really like, that's not there. That infrastructure isn't there. However, my co-founders and I would consider them some of my best friends. And I know there's some chatter about like, don't go into business with your friends and vice versa. But the funny thing is they weren't I wasn't as close to them before I worked with them. So we're friends because we are so close and we work together. And by cultivating that kind of casual, I don't know if casual is the right word, informal relationship, talking about things outside of work, it helps us build the business more naturally. And by just having that chatter, having those like, what are you doing this weekend? Or like, what's on your mind this week? Or what's happening outside of work? Or, you know, I can tell something's going on. By having that sense of like comfort, you kind of cultivate those serendipitous conversations I think you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. And I think like, I mean, I think sharing some of this stuff and like chit-chatting, right, with your colleagues, like it also opens it up to allow people to be more empathetic to you. Yeah. Like maybe this is too obvious of an instance, but I moved not too long ago, and I mean, I took some time off, but there's also kind of this unspoken like understanding that like when someone moves, like it takes a while to get back on track with like organizing all your stuff and whatnot. And it's never come up, but I imagine that for, you know, the couple weeks afterward, or, you know, several days afterward, that Rand and Casey are probably like, oh, like Amanda just moved. Like she's probably still dealing with like a bunch of house organization, whatever stuff. Right. Like, I think, yes, like it wasn't spoken. It was just more of like, when you know that about your colleagues, like something a little bit extra, it helps you think about like, oh, I think Allie's probably really busy with this thing with her family. Like, I'm going to go ahead and like respond to some of these emails because she probably isn't looking. Like things like that like, that might sound obvious in some ways, but like, obvious in the sense of like, if you're out of office, obviously you can't answer email, but there's a lot of gray area in remote work, right? Because if you have like a family thing, you might be like, oh, I'm going to log out for a couple hours, but I'll be back later.
Right.
Which fine. But one of your colleagues might say like, oh, I know Allie's busy, but like, I want to just help her out and like do a couple extra little things that are not a big deal for me to do while she's out.
It's almost like by sharing more of yourself, it creates more boundaries. I think people think withholding information is the way to work-life balance. And I would disagree. I mean, there's obviously a sweet spot, and it's not that you just openly share with everybody you work with. I think you and I are both at very small organizations, so I can't speak for the big companies, but at least in the culture that we're trying to create, like we're relatively open about what we're doing. Like one of our strategists he's running ultra marathon. See, I don't even know the word. Ultra marathon, 65 miles.
Well, I think it's 52 because you run a marathon and then you run it back.
Maybe it's 65 kilometers.
Oh, maybe.
He lives in Thailand, but he's running it through the Alps. And so he put his like time off on the calendar. Like he's been very like straightforward with that. But we all have the understanding like he's training. And afterwards, he's going to be at maybe half capacity. I would be at zero capacity if I had to do that. But he's going to be at half capacity, if that, even though he's online. You know, you just know that. Like we're all human. We have a lot of shared experiences. But it's been so interesting being part of a small team again. And I love it. I love it so much. So
that's a great example too, because that's something where you can, and then like you as a colleague can be like, oh, I'm so excited for him. Like that's so cool. And like, and even say like, hey, do you happen to have any pictures? Like, I want to see them. And then being able to like, and having the empathy for afterwards where like, it doesn't mean you can't talk to him because he's recovering, but you might be like, oh, he probably needs some extra sleep. Like,
or is there anything I can help with, like, as you kind of get back to normalcy? So, especially too, like being a remote culture. I mean, I don't have a lot of like reason to leave the house these days. Like I work from home, like I'll go to the gym and stuff, but it's nice to have friendships through work too. Not that work is like your everything, but I'd imagine, you know, talking to Rand or Casey, sometimes it's like, that's kind of the friend serotonin boost I needed, or the human serotonin boost I needed. So well, little tangent on working at a small company. I love it. I want to talk to you about audience building. I know it's a kind of like quiet quitting, lots of talk about it, lots of like strategy around it. And I know, you know, you've built quite a following on Twitter, as I'm sure, you know, other networks, but definitely Twitter, because that's the one I know you through. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you define audience building and like how you think about that when it comes to like what you share, how often you share, and then also how you engage. Because I feel like you're really good at responding to like everybody's tweets. Like very good.
That's super nice. Thank you. I feel like I don't know if there's any best phrasing for it other than audience building, right? Like I don't know what else to call it. But I think with that, I feel like it's such a loaded term in that some people are like, cool, normal term. I mean, that's what you would call it. Or they'd say, I really want to build an audience. Or they would say, that sounds gross and that sounds super douchey. And why would anyone admit to doing that? But I think there's just so many, it can be very polarizing. But the way I see it is like, it's not so much about like building the biggest audience possible. It's not about like, to me, it's not about, I want to get to 1 million or like 500,000 or 100,000. To me, it means defining who it is that you want to speak to, like who it is you want to reach, and then creating content for that audience. And then hoping, right, like that the content you create resonates with them. So when I say, you know, creating content for a specific group of people, I also mean doing this with a goal in mind. Like, is the goal to drive more leads for your business? It could be, you know, it could be wanting to meet new friends, like wanting to meet intellectual peers within a certain sector or hobby that you have. Totally makes sense. In my case, I wanted to never have to do a traditional job hunt again. And so for me, that meant I'm going to tweet and write about marketing. and the parts of marketing that I know well. Like, so from me, you probably won't see a teardown of like what some other company is doing and how they're doing it, how they're going about it with their marketing efforts.
Right.
Because the way I see it is I don't work on that team. I don't know how they actually make decisions. There are certainly a lot of brands I admire, a lot of tactics I admire, and I'll cite them as I can when I have the fuller context. So I tend to write from the things that I know really well, or the experience that I've had, like the tests that I've done. So I write about marketing, content marketing, because that's where I have most of my experience. And in doing that, I was able to attract the like-minded people. Like I was able to attract other marketers, right? And then like by extension, other potential employers. And that was really how Rand found me. Like, of course, I was already following him online, but after a few months of tweeting about mostly content marketing, he followed me back. And that was really exciting. And I think what's interesting, or what I think is meaningful to call out here is I certainly had the moment of like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. Like he's going to see my tweets now. What do I do? And I don't think I tweeted for a couple of days out of just pure self-consciousness, but it did make me think about, okay, Rand is someone who obviously knows content marketing. So he's not looking to learn content marketing 101 from me. What he's interested in is my perspective on content marketing. Like what do I think about it? What are the things that I've done that have been effective? What are the things that I'm seeing that are interesting? So I started tweeting about those things, and I made it very personal to me. But when I say personal, I mean things for which I have a unique perspective on, or I feel like is, my perspective on. And I would love for more people, and lots of people to do this, right? To like figure out your personal sort of content strategy, figure out like why you want to post online in the way that you do. And then, leveraging your experience, your expertise to propel yourself forward.
I agree. And I'm in the self-conscious boat still. And I don't know why. I think I'm relatively skilled at what I do, but something about like, it's one thing to post like a generally accepted concept, maybe put a little spin on it, but to throw things out into the world that are your own, like they're inherently more powerful and more impactful, which you pretty much just said, but they're also a larger risk. So, and I'm curious from audience members of yours, let's say, and then they're in the mindset of just consumption, right? Like they're reading a lot, they're inspired by a lot, like they are following, to then go and take up your own microphone. It's hard, I think, to change that mindset from consumption to kind of posting your own stuff. Maybe some people receive information really well and they can kind of use it to inspire themselves to post their own perspectives. But I imagine it's hard being an audience member and then being in like a audience leader, or I'm not sure what phrase I'd give it, but how do you balance that? I'm sure you have folks that you follow, you look up to, Rand being one of them. How do you kind of separate those parts of your brain? If they are two parts, maybe they're just one.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I mean, I guess because like I really like my job and what I do. So it doesn't really feel like I have to kind of separate anything. Like, so when I go on Twitter and I talk about marketing and read about marketing, that's what I actually want to do. I think sometimes people are like, why do people want to talk about work? I just want to talk about like personal, like whatever interests. And that's totally fine. But I just personally don't enjoy doing that on social media. Like I prefer, I like my work. I like talking about it. I like learning from others. So I think part of it is just that it doesn't feel like a slog for me to do that. It's inherently fun. But I want to go back to what you said about it feeling risky to talk about more of the like personal or like, personal perspective or stuff you've experienced. Why do you think it's more risky?
I think it's just introducing new concepts, new ways of thinking about like established things, maybe what's the word? Contrarian opinions, like things that you believe that maybe not that many people do. There's a lot of power to that. That's how people get audiences, right? But it always comes with the pushback too, right? Or folks that are like, that's stupid or that's dumb. And I don't think a lot of people on Twitter talk like that, but, and I think the community that we're a part of is incredibly supportive and just curious by nature. But yeah, and that's actually one of the questions I have for you is what's one thing that you believe about content marketing that most people would disagree with you on?
Oh, so I'm going to say that, so I see your point about like it being risky to like have these points of view. And I think I agree with that. But I don't know if this is like a sideways thought, but what I was going to say is when you talk about your experiences, like things you've tested, things you've done, things you have like studied, like actually studied or like kind of have been able to do some intel on, like maybe interviewing a friend about something. I think doing those things or like sharing your experience, for instance, it might feel scary. But I actually think it's less risky to go that route because if it's an experience that you have and that you can talk about, you can crystallize, you can prove essentially, then there's less for people to poke holes into. Yeah. Cause like what I actually, yeah. So maybe the thing that I believe about content marketing that most don't is I think people think that doing teardowns, like taking an example, like here's how Canva built their moat, like, and being the person outside looking in and like, doing whatever, like outside kind of research to write this piece or whatever that piece could be, or like doing those kinds of teardowns. I don't think that's a good idea because one, it's essentially information arbitrage. Like anybody can do that theoretically, right? Two, that also requires making a lot of assumptions about the way a team operates. Yeah. Like, because I had been in-house at a tech company, at Fitbit for so long, like, I just know that like, and it's not going to be surprising to anybody, not really, which is there are just day to day, so many decisions that are made that are completely arbitrary that just come from like, I don't know, just get the thing done. Yes. Or like, I don't know, just hire my friend who runs that agency. They're fine. Right. Like, and there's nothing, it's not like these things are like horrible or bad. It's just, when we are on the very outside looking in and being like, oh, Canva like found all these keywords and then they like dominated them and they create all these pages. Like, yeah, maybe they did. Maybe it was a very purposeful way they went about it. I don't know. And that's kind of the point is like that could have happened, or they maybe created helpful content and then it ended up being that it backed up into a really good keyword strategy. Yeah. Like, we don't know. So like, I don't think it's a good idea. I think most content marketers would say like, yeah, get more outside research. I'm going to challenge that and say, I think there's so much that we don't know being on the outside, and you're better off writing from your own perspective and your own experiences, the things that you can actually prove.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that. And that's why I too have not invested in teardowns like that. And being at HubSpot and Shopify, like two big teams, two very different mindsets of content, purely different methodologies too, basic methods too. Like SEO is obviously a part of it, but like the approach, the leadership was different. The executive leadership was different. The product teams were different. It's just, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen and a lot of opinions that you can't even begin to relate to. And it's funny that you said that about accident versus intentionality. Masterclass was a content program that we used as an example when we were building our course, not in any like critique kind of way, but just as an example, XYZ of a couple different concepts. And I recently met one of the three folks that were part of that team that built that entire content program. And she's like, oh yeah, that was an accident. And I was like, well, that was a pretty awesome accident. And she was like, obviously we wanted to do that. Like that it wasn't a bad accident, but like we didn't write this 20,000 page strategy and implement it piece by piece. And bam, here we are ranking on page 1 for just a gazillion terms. And I was like, that is so cool. Like the fact that that was accidental, obviously like with good intentions, it made me think like how many awesome things were probably by accident or like didn't turn out the way that the founders or the creators thought they would. Like it just makes so many things feel more possible, but also it just, you look around and you're like, I have no idea how that works behind the scenes. Yeah. So I'm going to echo your your opinion on that, Ontario.
Oh my God. I love that you cited this, because Masterclass is one of those content examples that's cited as like, they did all this, like they have all these keywords, they dominated like this. And I kind of think like, I feel like this was accidentally on purpose. Like, yes, they wanted to create the best content on a certain subject. Of course they did. Like that's the business model. I don't think that requires like an Ahrefs account to like do that. Right. Like that's what they wanted to do. And then like, maybe they got like a great video of Gordon Ramsay cooking eggs. And then it became, well, we have this great video of Gordon Ramsay cooking eggs. Why would we not do a blog post on this? Right. Like I think a lot of what I'm not saying that like it was easy, right? What I'm just saying is that like, I can see how a very competent marketer was just intuitively like, obviously we should do all these amazing things. And then it worked out because it's a great product and great content.
Yeah, no, that was a really interesting thing to learn. And I was just like, well, y'all are looked up to across the board. And she's like, yeah, it's been really cool to be a part of that. It's just like, I don't think it was as fancy as people make it out to be. You know, there was a lot of, like you said, intuitiveness and trial and error. And I don't know, the result was pretty awesome. So I do have a couple more rapid fire questions for you, if you'd like to answer those. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh, in marketing or in general?
Up to you.
You know, the best piece of advice I've received is act as if. Like, act as if you know what you're doing, as if you know what you're going to say. And I got this advice from a former manager who I was, you know, much younger in my career and had very much struggled with having a strong presence, like in a meeting and stuff. And she was like, honestly, just act as if. Like, you deserve to be here. You can do this. Just act as if, and the rest will follow. So it's sort of like flipping imposter syndrome on its head.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I like that a lot. Kind of like fake it till you make it in a way. But I like your saying better. Okay. What are your favorite books and podcasts even that have nothing to do with your job?
Oh, my favorite books. So some of the most influential books for me have been one, Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. It's a pretty easy read and it's pretty short, but he breaks down different kinds of ways to communicate that are not violent. And it's very much helped me with the way I speak or like the way I communicate, but also with the way I receive information. Mm-hmm. So like if I'm hearing someone speak very emotionally about something, it's helped me kind of read between the lines and understand, like, here's what I think they're actually saying. Like if someone's afraid of a situation, I can sense like, oh, they're not being defensive at me. They're afraid of this situation. And I think it's because of this reason. So that's one. The other one is this book called The Choice by Dr. Edith Ava Eger. I think that's how you say her name. Okay. But she's a Holocaust survivor who is now, she became a therapist, and I think was one of the like earliest therapists to really focus on PTSD. Mm-hmm. And this book is a memoir of hers, and it's such a beautiful book. Like the pain, the violence that she has experienced in the Holocaust throughout her life, like, and she has emerged from this as an extremely positive person. Like just reading that her story has been very inspirational and really enlightening to me and humbling. Like that's truly humbling, like getting to read someone else's story of this like unimaginable pain and violence and seeing how they came through the other side without any pity for themselves, I think is just so beautiful. And then a podcast that I like, I really like Jay Akunzo's Unthinkable podcast. It's such a fun show to listen to. It just feels like being plopped into his world where the way he talks about things, the kind of analogies that he gives, it's just it's fun. I mean, it's ultimately a business podcast or like a marketing podcast, but it's also a storytelling podcast. And it's just really refreshing to listen to.
That's awesome. I'll have to check that out. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Amanda. The last question I have for you is if you'd like to share anything with our listeners, where they can find you online or anything you're working on.
Yeah. So I'm going to say, check out SparkToro. We provide audience research tools for all kinds of marketing strategies. Check us out at SparkToro.com and check out our audience research newsletter. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Amanda Nat.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Allie.